Hi, I'm Femi OK and you're in the stream. Today, will Eurosceptic anti-EU parties have a sizable alliance in the next European Parliament? We discuss the upcoming EU elections and what this could mean for the future of Europe. So Malika Bilal has one more day of vacation. She'll be back tomorrow. Subbing in for her, our guest digital producer Omar Badal, making work really hard today. Let's see, do we have a community that's Eurosceptic or Europositive?
We are getting a ton of actually both kinds of comments.
Right.
You know, we have a lot of comments about essentially whether the EU has been useful or not. And
Sure.
we have here, take a look at my screen, we have Wojtek here. He's actually one of the stream's producers. He said, if we identify as European, there must be Europe-wide concerns that can be held by a body such as the European Parliament. On the other hand, we have Lanson here who says, the EU has so far failed in creating a European Union of peoples. What do Denmark and Portugal have in common, he rhetorically asks. So lots of very smart tweets coming in, and you can contribute to those smart tweets by tweeting in using the hashtag that you see on your screen right now, AJStream.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Brack. I'm Manager of Curriculum Impact at Code 2040, and I'm in the stream.
In a few weeks' time, European voters will get the chance to elect 751 members of the EU Parliament. Now, according to opinion polls, the right, who have often run on anti-immigration and anti-EU platforms, is projected to do well. Since the last elections back in 2009, the European public is less enamoured with the EU. The economic crisis in the Eurozone has led to scepticism about the future of the euro and the idea of European integration itself. Meanwhile, Eurosceptic parties in countries like France, the Netherlands and Austria have been able to make gains. Now, with the first European Parliament election since the Eurozone crisis, there are some growing concerns about how these parties could influence European policies. To help us talk about this, we're joined by Paul Oakley. He's a London candidate for the member of the European Parliament. He's also the chairman of the United Kingdom Independence Party in Greenwich and Lewisham, also known as UKIP. Abdul Turay is a British politician and journalist. He's standing for the European Parliament in Estonia. Emilia Andersdotter is a member of the European Parliament representing the Swedish Pirate Party, and Zakari Puisto is also running to be a member of the European Parliament for the True Finns Party. So politicians and would-be politicians, it's great to have you here in the stream. Let me start with Paul. Paul, take me out on your campaign trail right now. What is the kind of attitude that you're hearing from your potential voters, your electorate?
Well, it's incredible. Certainly in my part of southeast London, the boroughs of Greenwich and Lewisham, we didn't have a branch there 2 years ago. We're new. We're getting huge amounts of interest, not only with people wanting to join up to the party, but also to stand as candidates in the local elections. We're having our local elections on the same day as the European elections. But just going down the streets, knocking on doors, going into the blocks of flats, we get an astonishingly positive response. There are, it has to be said, one or two people, typically of the swivel-eyed left, who won't have anything to do with us, but those people have been left behind by history, and we are going to do extremely well on May the 22nd. What
does this astonishing positive response sound like?
Well, people are sick and tired of the old parties in our country. I'm often reminded of George Orwell's book Animal Farm, where the animals looked from pig to man and back again and couldn't tell the difference. You really cannot set out any differences in policy between the old parties in the United Kingdom. They're all in favour of Britain's membership of the European Union. They've all been bought off in one way or another, and they're forgetting the people in the streets. Certainly in many constituencies for the British Parliament,
right,
the MPs are in safe seats and they can be there for decades, and the people who actually vote them in there and are sick and tired of this. They're hungry for a change, and UKIP is giving them that change.
All right, so let's end up party political broadcast on behalf of UKIP and go across to Estonia with Abdul. You're also campaigning to be an MEP. Are you getting a similar response that Paul's response is that Paul's getting?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
You know, totally different. Yeah. Here, people are very strongly for the European Union, and people have seen how it's benefited them. Now, you could say, well, that's because Britain pays into the euro and Estonia receives money from the European Union. But it's not just that. People want to trade with the rest of Europe. People want to live in other parts of Europe. People want from other parts of Europe to live here. Paul represents a party. Now, unfortunately for Paul, he's got another British person on the other side who contradicts the very fact that I'm standing as a candidate in Europe in this election, and the fact that I'm already elected to the city council. Could you have imagined that would be possible if you didn't have such a thing like the European Union? This creates opportunities for British people.
May I ask you, do you have Estonian citizenship?
No, I don't. No, I'm a British citizen.
Why on earth don't you? Why on earth don't you go for it? If you're going to get involved in the politics of a different country, then you ought to become a citizen of that country and act accordingly. We have a similar thing in the United Kingdom. There's an appalling party has just manifested itself. I think it's run by one of the Romanians who came over after January the 1st. And I'm absolutely disgusted that people from other European countries can interfere with our domestic politics. If you want to become a naturalised citizen in Estonia, good luck to you. But otherwise, no.
No, wait a second. People voted for me, right? I was elected to the city council by people. They made a choice. They could have decided, I'm not going to vote for him because he's not Estonian. I'm sure some people did think that way, but people decided. People make that choice for themselves, right? They made a choice. I'm going to vote for him. I'm not going to vote for an Estonian candidate. I'm going to vote for him. That is democracy. Okay. What you're talking about is xenophobia, right? And a very xenophobia.
Give it a rest. No. Absolute rubbish.
Gentlemen, I'm going to interject for a moment. Paul and Abdul, I'm just going to interject for a moment because I'm going to push this conversation on a little bit. Hold those thoughts. We will come back to you. Omar.
We have a video comment from Jody that kind of comments actually on this very debate. Take a listen to this.
I think Euroscepticism is on the rise in Europe because people are becoming disenfranchised with politicians and the way they are, and they're feeling like they're not getting their point of view across, and this is leading to people wanting to be Eurosceptics so they can have things for their own country and their own people before those of others.
So, Amelia, do you think that membership in the European Union makes politicians less responsive to people in their own countries? And if that is a problem, how would you solve that?
I don't think that it's the European Union as such which makes politicians less responsive to people's needs. It's difficult to carry the responsibility of being a legislator, and that is equally difficult at a local level as it is on the European level. That is why in many European countries we have very big corruption problems. Ultimately, people or politicians, just like 5-year-old kids, they don't want to be accountable for what they do. And this is something also that a lot of grown-ups struggle with. What do we do with all of the accountability? A lot of the international developments, I think, over the last few decades have led to some market and political structures that makes it very, very easy to avoid accountability, both at the local level and at the European level. And an outstanding challenge for the future in Europe is how do we solve the accountability problem? How do we ensure that we have the right amount of responsibility exerted for the right thing at the right level? And if we could accomplish that, then I think the European level wouldn't necessarily be a problem.
So, Kali, I'm just wondering, that phrase, that term Eurosceptic, what does it actually mean to you? Do you feel comfortable if somebody calls you that?
Well, I would say that we are more like Euro-critic. So we are not Eurosceptic at all if you associate it with any kind of far right or like outright, like leaving Euro or leaving EU. But definitely we want a more democratic Europe, we want a more transparent and open Europe, we want to stop this federalist program. So that's where we come from.
I would agree with Zachary in part. I think the phrase Eurosceptic is a sloppy one, because if you're sceptical about something, you're not sure. Well, there's really no excuse for not being sure about the European project. I'm not a Eurosceptic, I am an EU realist. I understand the problems of the European Union. I'm opposed to Britain's membership of the European Union, and I act accordingly.
Amelia?
You are an anti-European. No,
I'm anti-EU. I'm anti-EU. Don't put words in my mouth. I'm anti-EU.
Well, I mean,
Yeah,
Paul,
I mean-
if you allow me, Abdul, also, if you allow me, I would argue that Paul says it's positive to have free trade. We have all of these international
Yes.
institutions for free trade and agreements which are made between the executive institutions of governments which don't have the same transparency and accountability requirements on them as democratically elected institutions. So if you accept the assumption that a free trade agreement, for instance, is an okay way of building international relationships where you have very little accountability in how the rules are made and where also the enforcement of the rules is typically very weak, then I don't see why having more transparency in the decision making and a better system for an enforcement of the agreements that are actually made, as is the case with the European Union, would necessarily be a problem. It seems to me that you're opting actually for the less accountable system and the system which has less responsibility for those with power in it, and it's just contradictory to me that you would do that.
Yes,
I don't understand in any way, shape or form how it's contradictory.
All right,
Sorry, by all means.
Yeah, let me share something with you. Abdul and Paul and Amelia and Zakari, let me just share something with you so our audience can see this. This is the turnout at the European elections from 1979 to 2009. So the turnout, 1979, 61.99%, and then we go down through the years to the last election was back in 2009, only a 43% turnout. So it's really interesting to hear you argue for the European Union or against the European Union, knowing that fewer and fewer and fewer people are voting for it. Abdul, why is that?
Well, I mean, you've just looked at the European parliamentary elections, but I pointed out that the European Union operates on many different levels, multi-level government, not only the European parliamentary election, for example, the local elections. I mean, I'm elected as a European citizen, not as a citizen of Estonia, as Paul pointed out. By the way, Paul, the reason why I'm not a citizen of Estonia is because I haven't been in the country long enough. You have to be in this country for at least 8 years to become a citizen, and I've only been in the country 6 years.
Well,
right,
well,
so
is it possible for me to make a comment?
yeah, but that option is not available to me.
Yes.
Right. So and people do vote in the local elections. And if you are living in a local community, if you are a foreigner, why can't you take a role in deciding simple things like, are there enough kindergarten places? I mean, that's what I campaigned on, right? Because I have a son myself. And are there enough kindergarten places? If you are living in a local community in a country, as people are traveling from different parts of Europe,
I'm completely on Abdul's side.
And that's what the European Union was founded on.
I'm completely on Abdul's side. Normally,
Abdul, take a breath so Amelia can agree with you. Amelia?
Right. I'm completely on Abdul's side normally, but so when you look at the statistics on participation in European elections, you have to be aware that in the 1970s, Belgium and Luxembourg both force all of their citizens to go and vote, and that naturally keeps the voter participation very high. Most new member states that came in 2004 and 2007, they don't have those rules. So citizens are not obliged to vote, which means that voter participation is lower both in national and in the European elections. But we simultaneously have a problem, and this has been extremely visible in the Swedish elections this year, that top political leaders, the two leaders of the two largest parties in Sweden, both, at least one of them, actively discouraged people to go and vote in the European Parliament elections. And so we have this desire actually from, well, he felt that the Minister of Democracy had this plan to make a lot of voters go and vote, and then the Prime Minister said that, well, you know, if people don't go and vote, I certainly will not force them to go and vote. And I think that people anyway don't think the European Parliament makes a lot of important decisions. And when you have the foremost political leader of a country saying that to the people he is supposed to inspire with the belief in the democratic system, that shows there's something very, very wrong with how the governments are currently dealing with European cooperation.
Yep, I have an interesting comment here that just came on Facebook that I think, Paul, you might find interesting. We have Renee here who says, by the very successes of right-wing parties in the European Parliament, is anybody seriously believing that they will give up the newfound powers by voting themselves out of existence? It's not impossible, but it's highly unlikely. Paul, what do you think of this? Do you think that there's any chance you might just essentially be tempted to just stay in office if you actually do get there?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. This is a brief interregnum for me if I get elected. I've got a proper job. I'm at the bar. I'm going to take 5 years out. Hopefully, if we do get a referendum in this country in 2017, the British people will vote to leave. But I'm not interested in dining in fancy Brussels restaurants and creaming up the expenses. Power in the European Parliament is an irrelevance.
So why are you standing?
Why am I standing? Because, well, it's very simple. There are an awful lot of people in this country who are sick to death of the European Union. But the fact is, unless you have some sort of elected office, the media aren't interested in hearing what you have to say. So everybody who's standing for UKIP is going to be a figurehead for, if you like, the British resistance to the European Union.
Anyway, because you're just one of many people who will say the same thing. You're just a...
This is perhaps part of the problem. There is no European demos. We've got 750 odd European MEPs. There's, I think, 73 in the United Kingdom. Obviously those split on philosophical, political grounds. The very idea that Britain has any influence in the EU is utterly absurd. We are a tenth of the European Parliament, and everything's decided at Commission level anyway.
This is my
because UKIP, if I understand correctly, they're using their seats in the European Parliament to drain the resources that MEPs get to advance their political views, and this is because Britain has a proportional election systems in the European elections, and the UKIP isn't strong enough to get past the first past the post system into the House of Commons. So the UKIP is certainly using the European resources to their advantage in their member state. No, I mean, it's if you're not actually presenting that to voters.
Let's get this straight. Europe doesn't have any resources of its own. Europe is funded through taxation of the citizens of the countries who are members of the European Union.
Well, yes, but the elected members of the Parliament get a certain amount
which
of money
we are going to be using to argue the case that there should be no further extension of European law within the European Parliament, and at the same time to make the case for getting us out in 2017.
Okay,
it's
so
not
Paul,
Europe's
Amelia,
money,
Abdul,
it's our
I want to
money.
just make a little bit of space for Sakari here. Sakari, let's fast forward to the end of May. Let's say that you become an MEP. What's the plan once you get there as a Euro critic? What do you want to achieve?
Well, I think it's very important to sort of renegotiate the membership terms for Finland, and I also support the referendum, actually perhaps at the same time as the UK, whether we should belong to the EU at all. But considering the EU as it currently is, I think I would like to make it more transparent and definitely look more carefully at the Commission and the European Central Bank and reconsider the mandate that they currently have, because it's very undemocratic.
Omar.
So we have a couple of tweets here that are coming in. Mel says, let's see, take it to pull it up here. He says far right and far left, actually not particularly far for the left, euro-skeptic and center-right EU critical parties will do well in the upcoming election, but not well enough for substantial change in EU course. He goes on to say, but the vast majority of seats in the European Parliament will stay in the hands of pro-EU forces. So Paul, if that ends up being the case, if you don't get enough people in there to actually make any kind of change, what is the plan? I mean, are you just going to stay in a body that you dislike for as long as it takes to eventually, hopefully, one day get some change happening?
Yes, exactly. I mean, there's even the possibility that we will lose a referendum in this country in 2017. But we're not going to stop. We're going to carry on arguing, just as... there's a strong possibility that we'll lose if there's a rerun of the 1975 situation, when there was gerrymandering, there was lies by Ted Heath and the pro-Europeans, and there was loads of money thrown into the Yes campaign.
Remember, we
so
have an
it is
international audience right here, so if you're name-checking people, do explain for our international audience. But let me just take
I'll explain.
Yeah, go ahead, Abdul.
Ted Heath was the Prime Minister at the time. He was a very strong pro-European. And he didn't lie to the people. Right? And indeed, Margaret Thatcher was a very strong supporter of the European Union for many, many years. And she changed her mind. That has to be said. She did change her mind. But the Conservative Party used to be the pro-European party, right, for many, many, many years.
It still is. It still is.
All right, so gentlemen, just stand down for just a moment. Amelia is the only person who's an MEP right now. So Amelia, if there is this trend for Eurosceptic, Eurocritic politicians coming in to the European Parliament, what do you think the impact of that might be?
This is a very interesting question because actually I'm not sure. Normally we have, the European Union does a lot of market regulation, which means we have a lot of commercial actors who are very, very interested in what we do and how we regulate stuff and how it's enforced in various member states. In particular, we have a lot of national industries from individual member states who are very interested in European legislation working in their favor so that they can export their products to other member states. So the extreme right wing, as far as I can tell, they will either be kind of anti-establishment and therefore against strong industrial forces from particular member states, or they will be very easily flattered and therefore follow the lobbies very carefully. I'm not exactly sure where they will head, which makes them a bit arbitrary and flaky for me.
Let me share something with you. This is from Marine Le Pen. She said this to journalists going back in January, and she said, how to improve the European Union by making it collapse. We brought the Berlin Wall down. I want to bring the Brussels Wall down. I expect one thing only from the European system, and that's for it to explode. Abdul, what do you make of sentiment like that going around Europe?
Well, I think I should qualify when people talk about the extreme right. There is a difference. Well, I will be fair to the UKIP. There is a difference between, say, UKIP and the BNP in Britain, or for example UKIP and I would compare.
That's the British National Party.
Yeah, the British, the British, and because there are the extreme right-wing parties that are kind of like neo-fascist, really, right? And then there are parties that are like anti-European Union, let's say, like the UKIP party. They're not,
So let's bring this back. Let's bring this back to the elections.
So we have to make that distinction between the two when we keep going on about the far right. Yeah, there is a difference, right? Right. So I mean, I wouldn't put UKIP in that category.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, and Le Pen is in that category, in the first category, and is like almost like a neo-fascist party. So she does say crazy things all the time, right? So I wouldn't give much, credence to anything she says, right?
Right. Omar.
So even though we put this kind of rhetoric to be outside of the spectrum that might be acceptable, I mean, nonetheless, it is a lot of what actually is coming through online when we ask why there is such an opposition to the EU. So you have, for example, this tweet from England is for the English, who tweeted in saying, because essentially, why has there been this anti-EU sentiment? They said because the time has come to clean house, left-wing only dirty and dismember nations and national peoples. And then we have Juliet here, who says because people see what is happening in their countries, tradition and culture being suffocated by those with no respect for them. So essentially we're having that sentiment kind of coming in of people who do see, external cultures as somehow being problematic.
Can I jump in on what Marine Le Pen was saying? Just to be absolutely clear, we in UKIP, if other nations who are currently members of the European Union want to carry on with the federalist project, then that's absolutely fine. We wish them well. If the European Union was to collapse, naturally we wouldn't shed a tear. But all we want is to get our country back and to have national self-determination for the United Kingdom and to keep good relationships with the rest of Europe. And the other thing, I would classify the French Front National as a far-right party because they have a very foul-smelling strand of anti-Semitism which runs right through that party, and certainly you call them far-right, you call UKIP right-wing. We have nothing in common with the Front National. Let me make that absolutely clear.
Okay, and I think Abdul actually did that as well. Abdul, I would like you to take a breath as well as Kari and Paul as well, and Amelia, because we are actually going into our post show at stream.aljazeera.com because this conversation has a lot more energy in it. What is the feeling that you're getting from our online community, Omar?
It's probably increasingly skeptical. Probably people who are actually skeptical of...
While they're watching the show?
Essentially, yep. The live feedback that's coming in, people are actually skeptical of Euroscepticism, essentially. So they're
skeptical of Euroscepticism, so are they pro-Europe or anti-Europe?
They're actually pro-Europe. They're skeptical of the sense out there that the problem caused in European countries is caused by the EU.
I'm so glad you put that so succinctly.
As complicated as I possibly could.
Yikes! The conversation is not over yet. You need to go online at stream.aljazeera.com. Thank you for all of our guests for joining us. They're not going anywhere. They'll be in the post show. Meanwhile, on the next programme, they're called South Africa's Born Free Generation. They're people who were born after the end of apartheid. We'll look at how this group of first-time young voters might affect the country's elections next week. Stay with us. The post show is next. Stream.aljazeera.com. Omar and I will see you there. Thanks for watching. Hello again, this is the Streams Online post show. We've been talking about the upcoming European Parliament elections and the impact of the rising popularity of anti-EU parties, also known as Eurosceptics. The guests so far are giving me a very stimulating workout. Let's start with Omar before it throw it back to our guests to see where they're going to take the conversation next.
Yep.
Omar.
Femi, we'll put out the question of essentially what positive things are there from having the European Union? What positive impact has that had on societies? And we have a couple of tweets here. Arjan says the biggest benefit of the EU is freedom of movement, brought a lot of benefits. We need more EU, not less. Euroscepticism is silly. Goes on to say, also, single market with strong watchdog led to abolishment of roaming fees for mobile. So, Sakari, do you acknowledge these as positive things that have come out of the EU?
Yeah, I'm definitely positive towards the single market, and I'm also very positive towards the Schengen area, so the free movement within the Schengen area. But it's very important to distinguish this from the current EU, which is very federalist and which is very anti-democratic, and that's where the difference comes from. So I prefer to have the EEC, the European Economic Community, and free movement of people, but not any kind of further centralization.
Can you explain, Sakari, what you mean by anti-democratic, so all of our audience are on the same page as you?
Yeah, I mean, it's the current EU, it's so far from people. I notice it on the field all the time with the potential voters that they don't have any kind of connection what is happening to the EU.
Right.
And that's a big problem.
Right. So when you run, and if you're successful, how will you change that? How will you make that better connection, more engagement? What is what is on your agenda? What are you campaigning? What's your manifesto say?
Well, I think this power transition from Finland and also all the other EU countries to Brussels has to be stopped, and that's the basic thing. Bring the power back to people. Right.
Abdul, you've got a remarkable story. I'm just going to show people this little headline here on the BBC website. Black Britain aims to be Estonian MEP. This is a fantastic headline. How did this even happen? How did you get to be in Estonia running as an MEP? It's kind of remarkable.
Well, I came to Estonia for family reasons, just very, very personal reasons. And
do you mind if I tell our audience what that is?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I do mind.
All right.
But yeah, because you don't know that. No one knows really.
Okay.
But my wife is Estonian.
All right. That's what I was alluding to. I just wanted to say that your missus was Estonian. Go ahead.
And so I was, I've been living here for 6 years, and I've been working as a teacher and as a journalist and as an editor, and been writing about local affairs. And actually, as Paul said, that I did kind of feel well, it's not really my country, I should be involved, but I do live in the community and I pay taxes and I have a son who is Estonian, so I have to speak for him, right? So I decided to stand as a candidate last year and I was elected, and there was quite strong support for me, right? So that's a positive sign, and it's a very positive European sign, because obviously I don't look like everybody else here, right? Because I'll explain to the audience, I mean, this is the sort of place where you don't see black people at all, not at all, right? So it's a very positive sign for Europe, that people's attitudes can change and people can improve. Now, what Paul is promoting, and what the strongest thing that UKIP are doing in the UK, is campaigning against people coming into Britain from other parts of Europe. But I have to ask Paul, what if Britain were to leave the European Union? What would you do with all the millions of people who've come from Poland and from Lithuania, who are already in Britain now? Would you all deport them back to the countries they came from?
No, absolutely not. We'd allow them to apply for citizenship, and certainly there are a lot of people who have contributed to the British economy. They've set up businesses, they've paid their taxes. We're more than happy for them to stay. But what we want is a points system. What we don't want, for example, which is something that we've seen recently, is that before we opened the doors entirely to Romania and Bulgaria, you had people from Romania and Bulgaria coming over and registering as self-employed, doing work like cleaning or even something as absurd as selling the big issue, they then qualify
the big
for
issue
various state benefits.
is a magazine. Paul, just explain what the big issue is.
Yes, I'm sorry. The big issue is a magazine sold by homeless people in the United Kingdom. We do have a problem with homelessness. So basically, we want people in this country. We welcome people from Europe and indeed the rest of the world. Let's not be insular about this. We want them to come over and contribute to our country. But at the moment, we have had an estimated 4 million immigrants come legally to this country since 1997, and an estimated 1 million extra illegal immigrants. Well, what's wrong with that is house prices have gone through the roof. Young people can't afford to get on the housing ladder. Our schools are bursting at the seams. It's very difficult to get an appointment at your GP, and public transport is crammed. I'm very pleased, in fact, you've gone off to Estonia, because it's a lightly populated country. Maybe you should come back to London and see what it's like here now. This country is packed, and we're not going to keep our doors open to anybody and everybody. We're only going to take the best, and that is it.
I was in London 2 months ago. It's a very dynamic city. House prices have gone up because the government misjudged how many houses were needed years ago, and the Conservative government...
Nothing to do with the government, it's supply and demand. The government had no idea how many people would come in to this country through open-door immigration.
Gentlemen, I'm just going to ask you to take a pause for a moment, only because I know you're not going to agree on this point, and we're losing time in the conversation.
If we talk about house prices going up, house prices have skyrocketed in this country, which is a lightly populated country.
It's because of
calling time, Paul and Abdul. You know what calling time means. I'm calling time on this. Moving it on a little bit, Omar.
We actually do have another challenge for Paul, though, coming on Twitter. Florian
Are
Wagner.
you sure?
Yes.
Okay.
Florian Wagner just tweeted in actually a couple of minutes ago saying the UKIP is a bluff package promising to leave the EU but keeping up economic advantages at the same time. Do you have a response to this?
Sorry, UKIP is a what package? I didn't hear.
A bluff package, promising to leave the EU but keeping up economic advantages, basically suggesting that these things are not really compatible. How are we going to make it work?
Well, because we want to be part of a European economic area and trade with the European Union, just as, for example, the United States of America, China, Brazil, India, Pakistan, they all trade with the European Union, but they're not part of the European superstate. It's very simple. It's not complicated.
Okay.
Most countries in the world are not members of the EU, yet they trade with us, and that's simply the position that we want Britain to be in as well.
All right, so let me just go back to Amelia and Sakari. I'm really intrigued by the idea of an integrated Europe and how you see it. Do you feel right now with Euro-critics, Euro-skeptics, that maybe that idea of a unified Europe, is it under threat? Is this a speed bump? What is it, Amelia?
So, I mean, the fundamental problem of the European Union is that it's afraid of political leadership. The member states do not assign political leadership to the European Union. We don't get competent, knowledgeable and accountable politicians that are willing to take up offices in the European Commission, and very frequently actually the same in the European Parliament. Member state governments are able to relatively intransparently exert a lot of power through the Council of Ministers.
Okay, so Amelia, I hear where you're identifying the problem, but the idea of the European Union, that working, is it under threat?
Look at something very simple, like how the European Union deals with the internet. We have a global network of information which is capable of sending data around the globe at 200 milliseconds. Yet the products which are most difficult to send over the European borders are actually MP3 files and films. Why is that? We have completely failed to make use of new technologies in order to build bridges between European peoples. And in fact, when we discuss in Brussels the outstandingly important issues of how do we build future markets, often it turns into a battle between telcos and TV broadcasters. How unexciting is that? Where is the vision here? How do we actually make a Europe post-Berlin Wall in which people can communicate and get along?
You're doing a politician thing on me and totally avoiding the question. So Carly, help me out here. You're not a politician yet. No. So here's the question. Integrated Europe, European Union, is it under threat?
Yes, it is under threat. It's under threat by both the federalist people and it's also under threat by the far-right people. So I'm actually quite concerned about these far-right people and also the National Front. And I think that in these elections, the Euro critics, the moderate Euro critics like myself and the True Finns, we are probably going to become the third largest Euro parliamentary group in the Euro Parliament. EPP is the first, Socialist and Social Democrats are the second, we are the third. And if nothing changes after that, then it's a really big danger. Then I'm very concerned.
I mean, I actually disagree with Zachary. It's not the far right which is threatening European unity. It's the fact that the Swedish Prime Minister is actively discouraging people from participating in European democracy. It is the fact that, while at the same time member state governments are pushing very far this, we have this intelligence agenda now, intelligence agencies that work in the national interest, the Swedish intelligence agency and the British military protecting British and Swedish companies on the internet against the Chinese and the Russians. So while member state governments are very Euro-friendly, but at the same time protecting themselves obsessively, they're expecting their citizens to somehow be open and welcoming towards one another. The level of political hypocrisy we're seeing in member state governments is actually outstanding, and I can see why people are confused in how they could possibly interact or relate to one another with that kind of political leadership. That really needs to change.
Amelia, take a breath. We're putting a full stop at the end of that breath. If the way all of our guests debate is the way they talk to their constituents, we're probably looking at 4 MEPs by the end of next month. Amelia, Abdul, Paul and Zachary, thank you for being part of this conversation. I really appreciate it. Moving on the next AJ stream. They're called South Africa's Born Free Generation, those who were born after the end of apartheid. We'll look at how this group of first-time young voters might affect the country's elections next week. That's all we have time for right now online. That's where we will always be. Thanks so much for watching. Take care.